Okay, so 2 articles of impeachment, Democrats unveiling them today. They will first go to the House Judiciary Committee. They'll be voted there, it looks like this week. Presumably, they will pass, and then they will go to the House floor next week. If one or if both of those articles pass on the House floor, Donald Trump will be impeached. He will be charged officially by the House of Representatives with high crimes and misdemeanors. Then it's over to the Senate for a trial. Of course, if 2/3 of senators agree, the president would then be removed from office. That would be the first time in history a president is impeached and removed from office. Of course, the possibility of that actually happening depends on ultimately Republicans turning against Donald Trump. And that's really the question here, the politics of all of this. How do they look right now? Well, the simple answer is both sides look very dug in on this question. Democrats seem to be on board here with impeaching Trump on both of these counts, on both of these articles that Democrats introduced today. It looks like Nancy Pelosi really took the temperature of the Democratic caucus, made sure there was a willingness to go forward with these 2 particular charges. Democrats certainly on paper have the votes to get what they want out of the House. And there was no indication watching those Intelligence Committee hearings first a couple weeks ago, then the Judiciary Committee hearings that have taken place over the last week or so. No indication watching those 2 committees of any breakage among Democrats. So it looks like Democrats are on board with this by and large. Remember when you had that initial impeachment inquiry vote to authorize this entire process? This goes back a couple of months, but when you had that vote, only two Democrats voted no on that. They were both Democrats from pro-Trump districts. Otherwise, the entire Democratic caucus was on board. So Democrats in the House, looks like they have the votes, and it looks like they likely have unity there. What about Republicans? Any sign of Republicans turning on Trump? Well, again, if you watched those Intelligence Committee hearings, you got no indication of it from the Republican members on that committee. If you watched the Judiciary Committee hearings, you got no indication of it from the Republican members of the Judiciary Committee. In fact, during those committee hearings on the intelligence side, you had Will Hurd, a Republican from Texas. Will Hurd is leaving the House. He comes from a district that voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. He himself said he did not vote for Donald Trump in 2016. He was seen as one of the most likely Republicans, if there were going to be any, to turn on Trump. He said at the end of those Intelligence Committee hearings he did not think that Donald Trump had committed an impeachable offense. So again, no indication here of Republicans turning on Trump. Everything is pointing to a largely, we'll see what this actually looks like, but a largely party line vote in the House and an expectation that the Senate would probably look the same way. So the expectation right now, Trump would be impeached and then not removed from office. He would be acquitted by the Senate. That's what happened to Bill Clinton back in 1998. Republicans had the votes to impeach him in the House. They did impeach him in the House. They brought it over to the Senate. They did not have a 2/3 supermajority there. Bill Clinton was acquitted in February of 1999. I think the thing that's driving this was just you look at the polls. Republican voters continue to be about 90% behind Donald Trump on this. And if Republicans are 90% or so behind Trump, hard to see many Republican lawmakers breaking with him. And conversely, if you look at the Democratic side, you see very strong Democratic support for impeachment. So again, hard to see Democrats breaking with their own party either. And so that's where we are. It's a familiar story. It's been the story of the last few years, probably longer than that, but certainly the story of the Trump era is just polarization. Both sides really dug in two very different places.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.